Trapped by ghostly guides, a terrifying camping story. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow through the dense canopy of trees. My friends and I had been hiking all day, exploring the vast wilderness that surrounded our campsite. We were confident, experienced campers, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to morph into an endless maze. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun and adventure, a break from the grind of city life. But now, as we trudged through the underbrush, it felt like we were walking in circles. The shadows grew long, and the chirping of crickets was soon overshadowed by the unsettling silence of the woods at night. "Do you think we should turn back?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. She was usually the most fearless among us, but even she seemed uneasy. "We've been trying to," I replied, glancing at the others. "But it feels like we're getting more lost." Just as the panic started to set in, a flicker of light caught my eye. Ahead, through the trees, I saw the faint glow of a campfire. Relief washed over me. "Look! There are people over there!" I exclaimed. We hurried towards the light, our steps quickening with hope. As we broke through the trees, we saw a small clearing with a roaring fire. Around it sat a group of people, their faces illuminated by the flames. They looked up as we approached, their expressions warm and welcoming. "Hey there!" one of them called out, a tall man with a kind smile. "You folks look like you could use some help." "We're lost," I admitted. "We've been wandering for hours trying to find our way back to our campsite." "Well, you're in luck," the man said, standing up and dusting off his jeans. "We know these woods like the back of our hands. We can guide you back." Gratitude filled us. They introduced themselves as locals who often camped in the forest. There was Tom, the tall man with the kind smile, Sarah, a young woman with a melodic laugh, and an older couple, Jack and Linda, who exuded a parental aura. As we set off, following our newfound guides, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. The forest seemed darker, the air colder. But I pushed the thoughts aside, convincing myself it was just the stress of being lost. Tom led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He chatted amiably, telling us stories of the forest, its history, and its secrets. The path seemed clearer now, and for a while, my anxiety faded. But then, little things began to happen. Sarah's laughter echoed strangely, sounding more like a distant wail than a joyous sound. Jack and Linda whispered to each other in a language I couldn't recognize. And Tom's flashlight flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. "We're almost there," Tom reassured us. "Just a little further." My friends seemed oblivious, chatting and laughing, grateful for the company. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then, without warning, Emily screamed. We all turned to see her standing rigid, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed to the ground, and as we looked, we saw what had caused her panic. There, half buried in the dirt, was a skeleton. Its empty eye sockets seemed to stare up at us, a silent scream frozen in its gaping mouth. The realization hit us like a tidal wave: we were not the first to walk this path. Tom's smile never faltered as he turned to us, his eyes now reflecting the cold, unfeeling light of the flashlight. "Don't worry," he said softly. "We're almost home." The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I knew then, with a bone-chilling certainty, that we had to get away. But the path back was shrouded in darkness, and our guides, once friendly, now seemed like specters leading us to our doom. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and bolting into the darkness. My friends followed, our footsteps pounding against the forest floor. The spectral guides pursued us, their forms flickering like shadows cast by a dying flame. Branches clawed at us, and the forest seemed to twist and shift, creating new paths and closing off old ones. But we kept running, fueled by sheer terror and the desperate need to survive. Ahead, I saw a faint light, not from a flashlight but a warm, welcoming glow. It was the campfire from before, but something was different. The fire seemed to pulse with life, and around it stood figures dressed in clothes from various eras, their faces gaunt and haunted. "We're close," I shouted, urging my friends forward. "That has to be the way out." As we reached the clearing, the spectral figures around the fire turned to us, their eyes filled with sorrow. They didn't move to stop us, but their presence was a stark reminder of what awaited us if we failed to escape. Tom and his group emerged from the trees, their faces twisted in anger. "You can't leave," Tom snarled. "You belong to the forest now." The ground trembled, and a chilling wind swept through the clearing. The fire flared, casting eerie shadows that seemed to come alive. We had seconds to act, to find some way to break free. In a moment of clarity, I remembered the old legends about spirits and fire. Fire was a symbol of life, a barrier against the supernatural. Without thinking, I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it up, its flames casting a protective circle around us. The ghosts recoiled, their forms flickering as if struggling to maintain their shape. "Stay back!" I shouted, waving the branch. "We don't belong here." The spectral figures around the fire nodded in approval, their sorrowful eyes seeming to convey a silent message. We had to keep moving, to find the true path out of the forest. With renewed determination, we backed away from the fire, the ghosts unable to cross the barrier of flames. But as we turned to leave, the forest seemed to shift once more, and a path opened before us, illuminated by the glow of the fire. "Run!" I yelled, and we sprinted down the path, the sounds of the ghostly guides' enraged cries echoing behind us. The path twisted and turned, but we didn't stop. We ran until our legs burned and our lungs screamed for air. And then, just as we thought we couldn't go any further, we burst out of the forest and into the open air. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, the moonlight bathing us in its cold, silver light. The forest loomed behind us, dark and foreboding, but we had escaped, at least for now. But as I looked back, I knew this was far from over. The ghosts would not rest until they had claimed us. We had only delayed the inevitable, and the true horror of the forest still awaited us. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the forest as we stumbled out into the open field. We were exhausted, our bodies aching and our minds racing from the harrowing night we had endured. But we were alive, and the curse, it seemed, had been broken. "Let's get back to the campsite," I said, my voice hoarse. "We need to rest and figure out how to get home." My friends nodded in agreement, and we started the long walk back. The path seemed clearer now, the oppressive weight of the forest lifted. Birds began to sing, and the world felt alive once more. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still amiss. As we approached our campsite, a sense of relief washed over us. The familiar sight of our tents and the remnants of our campfire brought a semblance of normalcy. We collapsed onto the ground, too tired to do anything but breathe. "Do you think it's really over?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "I think so," I replied, though doubt lingered in my mind. "We broke the curse. The ghosts are gone." But as the words left my mouth, a chill ran down my spine. I turned to look at the forest, its shadows now long and deep in the early morning light. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees, watching us. But when I blinked, it was gone. "We need to leave as soon as we can," I said, my voice firm. "Pack up, and let's get out of here." We hurried to gather our things, the urgency in our movements driven by an unspoken fear. As we packed, strange occurrences began to happen. Our gear, which had been untouched, now seemed slightly disarranged. Emily found her water bottle half empty, though she swore she hadn't drunk from it. Jack's flashlight, which had been working perfectly, flickered and died. "It's just our nerves," I tried to reassure everyone, though I was struggling to believe it myself. "We've been through a lot." With everything packed, we set off towards the main trail that would lead us back to civilization. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, as if holding its breath. As we walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The trees seemed to whisper our names, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. We walked faster, our anxiety mounting. Suddenly, Emily stopped, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the rustle of leaves. But then, faintly, we heard it, a soft, ghostly laughter, echoing through the trees. "Run!" I shouted, and we broke into a sprint. The laughter grew louder, more sinister, chasing us through the forest. Our hearts pounded, and our breaths came in ragged gasps as we pushed ourselves to the limit. Just when it seemed like we couldn't run any further, we burst out onto the main trail. The forest opened up, and in the distance, we saw the parking lot where our cars were parked. Relief flooded over us, but it was short-lived. Standing in the parking lot, blocking our path, were the figures of Tom, Sarah, Jack, and Linda. Their faces were twisted with rage and sorrow, their forms flickering in and out of existence. "You cannot leave," Tom said, his voice a haunting wail. "You belong to the forest now." I felt a cold hand grip my heart. This couldn't be happening. We had broken the curse. We had escaped. Desperation took over. We broke the curse. I shouted. "You can't keep us here." Tom's eyes bore into mine, filled with a sadness that seemed to transcend time. "The curse is never truly broken," he said. "It merely shifts. You freed us, but now you must take our place." The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. We hadn't escaped, we had only traded places. The forest demanded its souls, and we were the new prisoners. "No," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be." But as we stood there, the ghosts advanced, their forms becoming more solid, more real. The forest around us seemed to close in, the trees whispering secrets of despair and doom. In a final act of defiance, I grabbed Emily's hand and turned to run. "We can't let them take us," I said, my voice breaking. "We have to fight." We ran, but the forest twisted and turned, the path we had taken disappearing into the shadows. The ghost's laughter followed us, a chilling reminder of our fate. The world around us blurred, and soon, we found ourselves back at the campfire clearing, trapped in an endless loop. The fire flared to life, its flames casting eerie shadows. The ghosts circled us, their eyes filled with sorrow and resignation. "You cannot escape," Sarah whispered. "This is your home now." As the flames grew higher, I realized with a sinking heart that we were doomed. The forest had claimed us, just as it had claimed so many before. The curse would continue, and we would become the new guides, leading the next unsuspecting campers to their doom. The last thing I saw before darkness enveloped us was the flickering flames of the campfire, and the haunting faces of those who had come before, welcoming us to our eternal prison. The forest was silent once more, the cycle beginning anew. The end. The Vanishing Point, a terrifying tale of disappearance and horror. The moon hung low and full, casting an eerie glow over the dense forest as our group of 5 friends ventured deeper into the unknown. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the stress of our everyday lives and reconnect with nature. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that none of us could have ever imagined. We set up camp at the edge of a pristine lake, its glassy surface reflecting the thick canopy of trees above. The air was crisp, and the sound of crickets and distant owls created an almost hypnotic backdrop. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and laughter, unaware of the horrors that awaited us. Liam, the adventurous one, suggested we explore an uncharted area of the forest the next morning. He had heard rumors from the locals about a place called the Vanishing Point, a spot deep within the woods that no one dared to venture. It was said to be cursed, a place where people disappeared without a trace. We laughed it off as just another ghost story, a way for the locals to keep thrill seekers at bay. Little did we know how true those warnings were. As dawn broke, we set out with our backpacks and a sense of excitement, following Liam's lead. The deeper we went, the thicker the forest became, the light from the sun struggling to penetrate the dense foliage. After hours of trekking, we stumbled upon a clearing, an ominous silence replacing the comforting sounds of the forest. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone obelisk, covered in strange, cryptic symbols. The air around it seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. Curiosity got the better of us, and we moved closer to inspect the markings. As we did, a chilling wind blew through the trees, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Guys, this place is giving me the creeps," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should head back." But Liam was undeterred. "Come on, don't be scared. It's just an old rock," he said, reaching out to touch the obelisk. The moment his fingers made contact, a deafening roar echoed through the clearing, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. Panic set in as we tried to make sense of what was happening. Then, without warning, Liam vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, leaving nothing but an empty space where he had stood. We screamed his name, our voices bouncing off the trees, but there was no response. Fear gripped us as we huddled together, our eyes darting around the clearing, searching for any sign of our friend. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence and the sinister obelisk standing as a silent sentinel. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." We turned to leave, but as we did, a shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. My heart raced as I saw a figure lurking in the trees, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Before I could react, the figure lunged towards us, and everything went black. When I came to, I was alone, the clearing empty save for the ominous obelisk. My friends were gone, vanished just like Liam. Desperation clawed at me as I struggled to understand what had happened. I needed to find them, to figure out how to escape this cursed place before it was too late. The eerie silence of the clearing weighed heavily on me as I stumbled back to the camp, my mind racing with thoughts of my missing friends. The obelisk's strange symbols seemed to pulse in the periphery of my vision, a constant reminder of the malevolent force that had taken them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. Back at camp, I found the fire pit cold and abandoned, our tents untouched. The sight of our belongings, hastily left behind, filled me with a deep sense of dread. I grabbed a flashlight and a knife, the only tools I could think of to defend myself, and headed back into the forest, determined to find my friends. The forest seemed to have changed, the paths we had walked earlier now twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. The air grew colder, and an unnatural fog began to roll in, obscuring my view. My flashlight's beam cut through the mist, but it felt like I was walking in circles, every tree looking the same, every shadow threatening to spring to life. I heard a rustling behind me and spun around, heart pounding. The beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse of a figure darting between the trees, but it vanished before I could get a good look. Liam? Emma? Anyone? I called out, my voice trembling. But the only response was the whispering of the wind through the leaves. Pushing forward, I came upon another clearing, smaller this time, with an old, dilapidated cabin in the center. The sight of it filled me with both hope and fear. Maybe my friends had found shelter there. But as I approached, the cabin's rotting wood and broken windows seemed to exude a malevolent presence, warning me to stay away. Summoning my courage, I stepped onto the creaking porch and pushed open the door. The interior was dark and musty, filled with decaying furniture and debris. My flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I called out again, my voice echoing in the emptiness. As I explored the cabin, I found signs that my friends had been there, Liam's backpack, Emma's jacket, Noah's camera. But they were nowhere to be seen. The only other room was the basement, its door hanging ajar. A sense of foreboding washed over me as I descended the rickety stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was a nightmare. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, similar to those on the obelisk. The floor was stained with dark, dried patches that I didn't want to think about too closely. In the center of the room was an old, wooden table with what looked like an ancient book lying open on it. The pages were filled with indecipherable text and disturbing illustrations. As I approached the table, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread stopped me in my tracks. The air seemed to thicken, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the basement. I turned to flee, but the shadows themselves seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting towards me. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form barely human, with glowing eyes and twisted limbs. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling from my grasp and rolling away, its beam illuminating the creature's grotesque face for just a moment before it was lost in the darkness. I ran up the stairs, the creature's growls echoing behind me, and burst out of the cabin into the foggy night. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I didn't stop until I reached the camp again, collapsing next to the cold fire pit, gasping for breath. The fog had thickened, and the forest seemed even more alien than before. I knew I couldn't stay there, that the unseen force would come for me too. With no other options, I decided to head back to the clearing with the obelisk, hoping to find some clue, some way to reverse whatever curse had befallen us. As I made my way through the twisting paths, the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't understand. When I finally reached the clearing, the obelisk loomed before me, its symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. And then I saw them, my friends, or what was left of them. They stood around the obelisk, their eyes vacant, their bodies stiff and unnatural. They moved in unison, chanting in a language that sent chills down my spine. As I watched in horror, they turned to face me, their expressions blank and their voices growing louder. It was then that I realized the terrible truth: they were no longer my friends. They were something else, something twisted by the force that dwelled in this cursed place. And it was coming for me next. The sight of my friends, transformed into hollow shells, was a punch to the gut. Their lifeless eyes and synchronized movements were a grotesque mockery of the people I had known. My instinct was to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. Their chanting grew louder, reverberating through the clearing. The obelisk symbols pulsed with an eerie light, casting an otherworldly glow over the clearing. I could feel the ground vibrating beneath me, the air thickening with a tangible sense of malevolence. Liam. Emma. Noah. Please, it's me. I screamed, hoping for a flicker of recognition. But there was nothing. They continued their eerie chant, their voices merging into a single, unearthly sound. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the night. It was coming from the direction of the cabin. I turned and ran towards the sound, hoping against hope that it was one of my friends, somehow escaped from whatever had ensnared them. As I neared the cabin, the screams grew louder and more desperate. I burst through the door and was greeted by a scene of pure horror. The creature I had seen earlier was hunched over a figure on the floor, Emma. She was struggling, her face contorted in pain and terror as the creature's twisted limbs wrapped around her. Without thinking, I grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor and swung it at the creature with all my might. It let out a deafening roar and released Emma, turning its malevolent gaze towards me. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, and I felt a cold, dark presence seep into my very soul. "Run, Emma!" I shouted, swinging the wood again. This time, the creature caught it in its clawed hand and snapped it like a twig. It lunged at me, and I barely managed to dodge, feeling the rush of air as its claws grazed my arm. Emma scrambled to her feet, her face pale and streaked with tears. "We have to get out of here," she cried, her voice shaking. We bolted out of the cabin and into the night, the creature's roars echoing behind us. The forest seemed to come alive with shadows, each one more sinister than the last. I could hear the pounding of our feet and the ragged gasps of our breath, but the creature's presence was a constant, looming threat. "There's a way out," Emma panted, clutching my arm. "I read about it in the book. The obelisk, it's a gateway. We need to activate it to escape." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. The idea of going back to the clearing, back to the obelisk and my transformed friends, was terrifying. But it was our only chance. We turned and ran towards the clearing, the creature's growls growing fainter but no less menacing. As we reached the clearing, the scene was even more nightmarish than before. My friends were now surrounding the obelisk, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. The symbols on the stone glowed brighter, casting long, flickering shadows. "We need to break the connection," Emma whispered urgently. "Distract them while I figure out the symbols." I nodded, swallowing my fear. I stepped into the clearing, shouting to get their attention. "Hey! Over here! Come and get me!" Their heads snapped towards me in unison, their eyes devoid of any human emotion. They moved towards me, their movements jerky and unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, leading them away from the obelisk. Emma moved quickly, her fingers tracing the symbols, trying to decipher their meaning. I could see the tension in her face, the desperate urgency of her movements. The creature's growls echoed through the trees, getting closer. "Hurry, Emma!" I shouted, dodging the grasp of one of my friends. Their strength was unnerving, their grip like iron. Finally, Emma let out a triumphant cry. "I've got it!" She pressed a sequence of symbols, and the obelisk began to hum with a deep, resonant sound. A blinding light erupted from the stone, enveloping the clearing. The chanting stopped abruptly, and my friends froze, their expressions contorting in pain. The ground shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air, drowning out everything else. The light intensified, and I felt myself being pulled towards the obelisk. I reached out for Emma, but the force was too strong. I was lifted off my feet, the world around me dissolving into a whirlwind of light and sound. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I found myself lying on the ground, gasping for breath. The clearing was gone, replaced by a dense, dark forest. I scrambled to my feet, looking around frantically. "Emma?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. But there was no response. I was alone, the forest eerily silent. A sense of dread settled over me as I realized the terrible truth. We had broken the connection, but at what cost? I was in a different part of the forest, separated from my friends, with no idea how to find them or escape. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the creature. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and it smiled, a twisted, horrifying smile. It stepped forward, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the nightmare was far from over. We had entered the vanishing point, and there was no escape. The creature's malevolent eyes bored into mine as it advanced, its twisted smile sending a wave of terror through my body. I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The dense forest around me seemed to close in, the trees whispering ominous secrets in the darkness. Desperation gripped me as I turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my skin and clothes. I had no direction, no plan, just a primal urge to get away from the abomination that pursued me. The creature's growls echoed through the night, a constant reminder that it was never far behind. Suddenly, I burst into another clearing, almost identical to the one with the obelisk. My heart sank as I realized I had come full circle. The same sinister symbols adorned a similar stone, glowing faintly in the darkness. The air around it seemed to hum with that same unsettling energy. And then I saw them, my friends, standing rigidly around the obelisk, their eyes vacant and their bodies unnaturally stiff. Emma was among them, her face frozen in a mask of terror. They were chanting again, the same eerie, unearthly language that sent chills down my spine. I had to act quickly. I couldn't let whatever malevolent force controlled them take me too. I rushed towards the obelisk, determined to break the connection once and for all. The creature's growls grew louder, and I knew I had only moments before it caught up to me. As I reached the obelisk, I noticed a pattern in the symbols, something Emma had figured out before. I began pressing the symbols in the sequence she had used, praying it would work. The obelisk hummed louder, the symbols glowing brighter. The chanting grew more frantic, my friend's expressions contorting in pain. Come on, I muttered, my fingers trembling as I pressed the final symbol. The obelisk pulsed with a blinding light, and I felt a surge of energy course through me. The ground shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air, drowning out everything else. The light intensified, and I felt myself being pulled towards the obelisk again. This time, I fought against it, digging my heels into the ground. But the force was too strong. I was lifted off my feet, the world around me dissolving into a whirlwind of light and sound. When the light finally faded, I found myself lying on the ground, gasping for breath. The forest was silent, the air heavy with an eerie stillness. I scrambled to my feet, looking around frantically. My friends were nowhere to be seen, and the obelisk had vanished. I was alone, the forest eerily silent. A sense of dread settled over me as I realized the terrible truth. We had broken the connection, but at what cost? I was in a different part of the forest, separated from my friends, with no idea how to find them or escape. And then I heard it, a faint, distant whisper, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from the trees, an otherworldly chant that sent chills down my spine. The ground beneath me began to tremble, and the air grew colder. The whispering grew louder, and I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved towards me, their faces twisted in grotesque masks of agony and rage. My friends were among them, their expressions vacant and lifeless. They surrounded me, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. The ground beneath me cracked and split open, revealing a yawning chasm of darkness. I felt myself being pulled towards it, the force irresistible. I struggled, but it was no use. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the last thing I heard was the creature's malevolent laughter echoing through the void. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the clearing, but everything was different. The trees were twisted and gnarled, the sky a sickly, unnatural color. The obelisk stood in the center, its symbols glowing with a sinister light. My friends were there too, their eyes glowing with the same malevolent light as the creature. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was no longer in our world. We had crossed over into a dimension where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred. The vanishing point wasn't just a place, it was a gateway to something far more terrifying. And I was trapped here, forever a part of its twisted, malevolent world.